Okay, I think the two preceding presentations have described very well the changes that are going on, the quite drastic shift towards populism that we've seen, not only in Britain but also in Europe more generally. So what I'm going to say I think fits very well because it's more about what the effects of this will be for decision-making systems, right? So if we see these drastic changes in the political arena, what effects will that have on democratic decision-making in the Western countries? My point of departure here is something Guri talked about at the very beginning, namely that an important aspect of populism is this rejection of experts, rejection of facts, rejection of what's true. For instance, going back to Brexit, the British politician Michael Gove famously said during the campaign, I think people in this country have had enough of experts saying what's best for us and constantly getting it wrong. In the era of Trump, post-truth politics, alternative facts, fake news are things we hear about every day in the news, really. So there's been a lot of debate about this, but in my opinion, this debate has also to some extent overshadowed what I think is a more fundamental question, namely what the rise of populism means for decision-making systems more broadly. So has populism upended the traditional way of making policies in the Western democracies? And if so, how? So the more specific question I'd like to ask here is, how does the rise of populism influence the traditional relationship between technocratic policymaking and popular politics? And just to say this, I believe this is an important question because it will have implications for how Western societies will be governed in the times of populism, which is very much the topic of the conference. So what do I mean by technocratic policymaking and popular politics? Well, in democratic policymaking, you really have different aspects, of course. You have more technocratic elements and you have more popular elements. And by popular politics, I basically refer to electoral democracy. Political parties competing for votes, and based on the votes they get in election, gaining representation in legislative bodies. In this sphere, you could call it a sphere, what's decisive is the will of the people. So decisions should be based on what people vote and what they express their support for in elections. And legitimacy is very much based on responsiveness, so basically tending to people's concerns. Typical actors here would be political parties, but of course also different kinds of interest groups. But as you all know, democracy is more than that, and this is what I here refer to as technocracy. We could perhaps also say elite policymaking. This is of course fairly broad, but I think you understand what I'm referring to. This is the more technical side of making policies in a democratic system. So that means basically the decisions taken by permanent officials in ministries, agencies, by various kinds of experts, both within the public sector, but of course also the way academia, for instance, contributes to policymaking. Here the standard for a good decision is very different than from the sphere of popular politics. So you would say that the good decision is a decision that's based on sound and relevant knowledge, a decision that will have good effects, so a decision of high quality, and of course a decision that's also in line with rights, laws, and so on in the country. Legitimacy here is based not on responsiveness, but on responsibility. So basically the quality of the decisions that come out in the end. So here we can talk about what's often called output legitimacy, while in the popular sphere it's much more about the input legitimacy. There are some obvious tensions here, right? So you can take an example such as Trump's so-called Muslim ban. a majority of the population may want that ban. On the other hand, it might not be legal, and there might be no evidence that the ban will actually have the desired effects. That would be to limit terrorism and increase security in the US. Another example could be the question of EU membership. So in popular politics, the answer to that would basically be whatever the people want. If you look from a more technocratic view, the question would be more, what are, for instance, the economic effects of staying within the European Union or of going out? Is it good for us? Will joining the European Union have positive effects? And you could base that on all kinds of different expert knowledge. So how is this tension resolved? Well, there are two sides to this, of course. On the one hand, the technocratic sphere or the elite sphere, to a certain extent, is loyal and accountable to popular politics. So, for instance, if you're a bureaucrat working in a Norwegian ministry, you're supposed to be sensitive to the political signals you get from elected officials. And there are also accountability mechanisms in place, of course, to make sure that the decisions made by unelected officials actually reflect the will of the government, for instance. But it's also important to remember that this is also a relationship characterized by delegation of decision-making responsibility. Think about decisions delegated to semi-autonomous agencies, for instance, and a relationship of autonomy, where bureaucrats are expected to behave also in an autonomous way vis-a-vis politicians. So, for instance, in Norway, we have this a very strong idea about professional concern, for instance, in public policy making, faglige hensyn. That's, for instance, a norm which very much belongs to the technocratic sphere. But that's a legitimate norm, for instance, in the interaction with politicians. So the question is then, how is this changing in the time of populism? How is the relationship between technocracy and popular politics changing? And obviously, I won't be able to answer that question here. I will not even attempt to do so. But what I've tried is to outline a few models for the potential relationship and how that's changing, based on some of our actual experiences with populism, which I think we often tend to forget. And I'll start with the Italian model. Some of you might have noticed that in right after Trump was elected, they interviewed people on the streets all over the world, and in Italy the reaction was kind of, they shrugged, right? And of course, to Italians, the election of a political outsider who's a billionaire and who has a tendency to say outrageous things about women and his political opponents was nothing new. Silvio Berlusconi was elected president as far back as 1994 in Italy, and he's very much a populist politician, even if it's nominally a center-right politician. He's been in power for at least a decade over the last 20-25 years, and what's striking is that he would be a person who would be very attentive to the responsiveness part of politics. On the other hand, this has been a period characterized by political instability, the inability to address the problems of the country, and in particular, the inability to address economic problems, right? To the extent that at regular intervals, Italians have turned to technocratic governments. What in Italian is called governo tecnico, which they used extensively in the 1990s to pass necessary reforms of the pension system, for instance. Often described as a success story, but in fact it was basically suspending electoral politics, getting someone in government who would actually take the responsibility for making reforms, and then returning to normal afterwards. I have a picture of Mario Monti here. This, of course, occurred again a few years back when a technical government was appointed. And you also see this, I mean, if you look at the last 5 or 6 Italian governments, for instance, there's not one politician who's been Minister of Finance. They always draw their Ministers of Finance from the technocratic sphere. So they would be economics professors, people who worked in the EU or in the OECD. On the other hand, Monti, in particular, was extremely unpopular, and his role was also perceived as illegitimate. So this was in no way a cure to Italy's problems. And you've seen very much a pendulum swing back to new kinds of populist movements. The currently biggest party in the Italian polls would be Beppe Grillo's five-star movement, which is polling us at more than 30%. So what I would like to say here is that the rise of populism in Italy, at least, has had as its effect a very unstable relationship between popular politics and technocracy. And I think you could also say that it's been fairly dysfunctional. Populist politics has been allowed to run its course until things have gotten so bad that they've turned to the technocrats and the other way around. Another model is the Irish model. And in Ireland, they actually have a party system which is based on populism from the beginning. So the Irish party system is not organized along the left-right axis as most other party systems. It's organized according to the cleavage between the people who supported the treaty with the Brits and the ones who wanted complete independence in the Irish Civil War in the early 1920s. The result has been two big parties, both ideologically flexible, catch-all parties who've basically done whatever over a long period of time. One good example of this is Charlie McCreevy. He's the old finance minister of Ireland during the so-called Celtic Tiger period, so basically from the mid-1990s onwards. These very ideologically flexible parties have stood across from a very weak administrative state. So fairly weak state institutions, also without a lot of the kind of professional competence that you, for instance, would have in some of the Nordic countries in the permanent administration. What's been the effect of all this in Ireland? Well, you saw very clearly during the last 15 years or so that the Irish state was completely captured by populist politics. There were absolutely no checks and balances on what the government did. So you know, whatever idea would pop up in Charlie McCreevy's head one night would be policy the next morning, and that's literally true. The effect was, Ireland was a big success story for a while, but that was, of course, based on policies that were not responsible, not sustainable in the long run. You had a huge economic boom that ended with an enormous economic crisis in 2007 and 8 and 9. So the second model, so the first model would be some kind of instability. The second model would be basically capture of the administrative system by the populists. Now on to the EU model, and simplifying a bit, of course, it's well known that in the EU, the European Commission, for instance, has very strong formal powers, while the accountability mechanisms and the democratic control is very weak and indirect. Often referred to as the democratic deficit, basically a lack of democratic legitimacy. At the same time, we've seen the rise of various anti-EU movements in a number of countries. This is a photo from the Netherlands where they say nay to the EU. How has the EU dealt with this? So the changes in the popular politics. Well, I think it's fair to say that the EU does not really have the mechanisms for including that kind of popular discontent in its policy making. Also because it's almost irreconcilable by definition. Much of the anti-EU skepticism. So here I think you could say that the result so far, at least, has been inertia. The EU has not been able to do much or change much in response to changes in popular politics. The final model I have is the Northern European model, and I'm then referring to Norway, for instance, Denmark, but also to the Netherlands in part. That is basically responding to populism by integrating populist party into the existing decision-making system. And I think the Progressive Party's participation in the government in Norway is a good example of this. So they come into government, they're forced to be responsible to some extent. But you could also think about external support, for instance, from the Danish People's Party of the right-wing government there. Or another form, this is perhaps maybe a fifth model even, that the regular parties pick up the political issues of the right-wing populist parties. The question then is, of course, what will decide in the end where we end up, in which direction we move. And I'm not going to provide any definitive answers to that. I think it's important to emphasize, though, that very much will depend on the interrelationships between these two spheres that I've outlined. So what mechanisms do you actually have for including new populist parties in old politics? How willing are populist politicians to be responsible, and how responsive is the technocratic apparatus? Thank you very much.